Hello fellow woodworkers and welcome to this week's edition of the Garage Workshop. This week we're going to be making a box jig for my table saw. Roll the intro. A slightly different project this week. This week we're going to be making a finger jointing jig for the table saw. Now, I am going to start by saying this is not an original idea. I am using the combination of Rag and Bone Brown and Bourbon Woodworking and 3x3 Tamar. I'm using a combination of all three of those videos and I'll link those in the description. This is mainly Rag and Bone Browns with a couple of amendments and I just want to see whether I can recreate it and it works. So the first thing to do is to select some wood. So let's do that now. So this is the wood that I have selected for the project. I'm not quite sure what wood it is. If you know what this is and you're watching, please put it in the comments. I'm gonna say there's a chance it might be oak, but I watch a lot of Rag and Bone Brown's videos and he's always talking about sapele, which is a sort of reddish looking wood. So it could possibly be that. It's actually an entire door frame which somebody gave me, which was recycled. And when I made the earlier video with the cross-cut sled, which I'll put a link to, the biggest problem with the cross-cut sled was the rails, after it was in here for a while, the rails got took on some water, absorbed the water obviously because it's cold in the garage, it was moisture, and they expanded and I could no longer fit them in the table saw. So that wood project didn't really work, and I don't think the wood I used was the proper wood, but this wood is really hard. So I'm going to use this to create the rails, and then on the top I'm just going to use some scraps of 18mm plywood that I've got and some MDF that I've got lying around. So the first thing to do is to cut this wood up and let's make the strips for the rails. So stage one was to cut the rail down. I was really careful. I have been taking on board all your comments about how I use the table saw, and as you can see I'm using the push sticks. The safety is very important, but this took a bit of going. I'm not sure what this wood is, as I said, but it was really difficult to cut. My table saw struggled with it all the way through. When I managed to get it to the required width, which as you can see was quite thin, and that was very deliberate because obviously the width of this strip needs to be the depth of the rail in the table saw. Now, it was very difficult to measure that. I tried 2 or 3 different measurements and got, 2 or 3 different results, but I eventually settled on the right size, and as you can see there was a little bit too much play in both of those. I wasn't quite happy, so I just adjusted it ever so slightly and ran the strips through again, and then that time, this was just a test, it was nearly there, not quite right, so I just made a tiny little adjustment and ran the strip through again, being really careful with the table saw here and using the push stick, and then eventually I got the size that I was happy with. The next stage was just pop over to the miter saw and I cut the piece of wood exactly in half, and then I just used some sandpaper to knock down the edges. There was just a tiny little bit. Now at this point I cut another strip and I had not realised, you can see on the left there, hadn't realised that my hoover had dropped out of the table saw. So this strip is for the bit that's going to make the pin in the jig, which you'll see later. And again, I'm being super careful here, keeping my fingers away from the blade and using both of my push sticks. Great wood this, and I'm really glad I chose it for the rails, but blimey, it was really difficult to cut. But I got the pin I needed, piece I needed for the pin there. Next stage was to cut down. This is just bog standard offcut of 18mm ply I've got that I had from another project. I just took it down into 2 strips to get it exactly the right size. Then I popped over to the miter saw, just cut it off level on both ends, and then I just used this to make a couple of sort of support guides for either side. So I just had the 2 corners, cut them at 45-degree angles, and then again I just knocked them back with the sander, just hand sanded them really to take off the rougher sort of edges. And to be fair, they were pretty good. There was just a little bit on each of the corners. I then went for the tight bond, which I've mentioned before, which is becoming my favourite glue. Just brilliant glue this, it's really, really strong. So I tight bonded both ends together, and then I could get the two little supports you can see lying around there and put them on either side. Now, it was never the plan to just leave this as wood glue. Obviously, you couldn't do that. As good as it wood glue is, you know, it's not a magician. So when I got them in place. I just got some 40mm brad nails and pinned them in. 40mm might sound like a lot, but I wanted to get this as strong as I could, and the rigidity was really, really important. So I put them into the gun, my airstrike gun, and popped them in after I'd clamped. One of the things that struck me at this point was, in order to try and keep it straight, I obviously had to clamp, and what I should have done was put some weights the other side, and that's why you can see one clamps one way up and one clamps the other way up to sort of counterbalance. But I know in Rag and Bones Brown, he's got some weights, like, you know, weights you might get in a shop, or gym weights to weigh things down, and that's really good idea. So I'm going to sort of keep an eye out for some of those. Soon enough, though, I had all the sides and the supports in, and it was all nailed up and ready to go. I then went back to the table saw to attach the actual jig to the runners. So I just used some washers here, which is commonplace. I know Keith uses those. And then I got a straight edge, which I was going to use to butt it up. Super glue, CVA glue, just a few dollops, and those of you that are observant enough will notice here there's a massive mistake. I'd stuck it on the rails the wrong way, but luckily I did remember, and I switched it round and weighted it down so you can see the marks there. But it stuck perfectly, and as you can see, it slid up and down, and it was really, really nice slide in the runners. I haven't put any wax on it yet, but obviously I will do. The next thing to do was to change the blade, and I have got a curving blade for this, and I'm going to explain a little bit about this blade in a minute, because I know it caused some controversy the last time that I used it, rightly so. Okay, so on a previous video on the Garage Workshop channel, I created some shaker style doors, and I used a grooving bit. Now, this being the Evolution table saw, the bore of the table saw is obviously smaller than a traditional saw, and this blade is a 30mm blade. It's got a 30mm bore on this blade. So when I used it before, quite rightly, lots of people pointed out in the comments that I'd used it and it was dangerous, and I removed the video, and I totally understand. Now, since that point, I've done a huge amount of research. I've looked at lots and lots of different YouTube videos. I've done lots of reading, and when I came across Thomas's video on casual DIY, he had the same problem. He's got the same table saw I have, so he used one of these rings. Now, this ring fits inside the blade, and it changes the bore from the current bore, which is on here. The current bore is 28.5mm, I think, or 28mm. So it changes this bore from this size to allow you to use a bigger blade. Now, I've tested it a few times, and it works absolutely perfectly. Now, the ring, you can buy these rings anywhere, on eBay, on all different places, but the one that I chose are Bosch ones, and all you do is simply place the ring in the middle of the blade, and you just give it a gentle tap in. Now, the width of this blade is 3 mil. The width here is 3 mil, and the ring that I've got inside there is a 3mm ring. So fingers crossed, it should work now, and it should be safe. So let's put the blade in and give it a go. I'm going to be honest, I was a bit nervous about doing this. Even though I tested it off camera, I was still very, very cautious. So I just ran the jig up and down through the blade. I didn't particularly select a size of hole. I just took one that I thought was about good enough. It was about 20 centimeters. I then got on a piece of scrap MDF, which was going to be the sort of front fence. I initially just held this on to make sure it was right before then reaching for some clamps. I'd slightly offset it. You can see on the video there, it's slightly offset, and I did that deliberately because I wanted to make sure that when it was on, the pin was more in the centre. I then set the blade height. I set the blade height to 12mm, which was the size of the wood that I thought I was going to be using. And then I put the clamp on and ran it through. And as you can see, the pin fits perfectly. I took it to the miter saw and very carefully cut the pin off. I didn't want to split the wood. And then I glued it into the sort of front fence. Now, just as Keith had done, I set the pin up just slightly off centre. So I used the rest of that piece of wood I'd cut the pin from to get the distance right. And when I was happy, it was time to give it a test. So I attached the piece of wood and off it went. And as you can see, it worked really well. To be honest, I dispensed of the clamp. And that is one of the major changes I would make. I need to come up with a better system for the clamping. So to set the second piece of wood to make sure they interlock properly, I twisted the first piece of wood round and used that as the marker. And then I just continued it from there, running it back and forward over the pin, in and out until all of the cuts were made. And I'm pleased to say it worked really nicely. When I was happy, I just pre-drilled the holes to attach the sort of outer fence to the inner fence and to make sure it was nice and secure, which it was. This piece of MDF I used was slightly bowed, but to be honest, by the time I'd screwed this in, it took the bow out. So the unit completely finished and working exactly as I hoped and expected it to. Okay, so here are my two pieces, the pieces that I just cut. I did make a little adjustment off camera, which you didn't see. I just adjusted the blade a little bit and it's given me the slightly longer sections in the box jerk. So when I put it together, it is quite loose. It's not really, really, really tight. But it's loose enough, but it does make the box joint. Now, it does need a bit of sanding off and gluing. So what I'll do is I've left a little bit of gap in there. You can see there's a tiny little bit, but that will be taken up by the wood glue anyway. So the joint, I think, has come out exactly as I thought it would. So very pleased with it. Overall impressions, it ended up being pretty much a complete carbon copy of Keith's. I think there's two things. Number one, you probably saw in the video, I did split the runner here. When I drilled it, I thought I'd already drilled a hole in and I hadn't done it. So I did split the runner, which was a bit of an issue, although not too much of an issue, to be honest, because I then just drilled and screwed it in. And the other thing is, you do need some sort of clamp or some sort of system to hold the wood, because as the wood goes over the blade guard in particular, it has a tendency to move around a little bit, and obviously you can't put anything permanent there because each time you're moving it, it would need to move with it. So I think something perhaps that comes down from the top that slides along here, but I'll have a think and maybe make that modification. But I set out for two things. Number one, to create a box jig that worked, and I've done that. I've got a box jig and it works, and it's really nice and flat. It's a really good right angle, so I'm very pleased. And the second thing was to make sure that I was able to use my table saw with my grooving blade, which, as you've seen in the video, hasn't been a problem all the way through. So that expanding ring that I bought, the Bosch expanding ring, I'll try and leave a link in the description, has worked perfectly. So it's allowed me to use the blade. So overall, really pleased and really impressed that it actually worked, and it doesn't look too bad either. It looks exactly like Keith's does. So although I wouldn't call this a rip-off video, this is more a homage to see if the things that you can see on YouTube made by other more professional people like Keith can actually be replicated, and I think I've proved that I have, and I will use this jig a lot. Maybe I won't use it for making box joints that are on public show, as it were, but if I'm making drawer sets or drawers in the future, particularly where it's going to be covered, then I think it's going to be invaluable. If this is your first time at the Garage Workshop, thank you very much for joining us. Please can I ask you to subscribe, like and comment. If you're a regular viewer, thank you so much. My last view on the Parkside Lidl tool haul got a huge amount of views, so thank you very much for all of that, and also don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you on the next video. Have a good week, fellow woodworkers.